Welcome. I'm Dilip Gaonkar, Director of CGCC and Director of CTS, the Center for Transcultural Studies. This online forum, Questioning the Present, is jointly sponsored by these two centers. Today's session, the 19th session, Questioning the Present, is devoted to Professor Axel Honneth's The Working Sovereign, Labor and Democratic Citizenship, which was published in English just recently in 2024 by Polity Press. We also have a panel of three distinguished scholars and respondents, Professor Elizabeth Anderson, Alex Gourevitch, and Stephen Sawyer. I will introduce all of our four distinguished guests shortly. Before that, let me state the protocols governing this Zoom session. Our webmaster is Behailu, Mihirete, a graduate student associate of CGCC. He is on the screen. This session is recorded for archival purposes and will be released to the public in a day or two, as we have already secured the permission of the four scholars assembled here today. The session will unfold as follows. After my quick introduction of all four scholars, Professor Honneth will introduce his book, The Sovereign Worker, for about 20 to 25 minutes, followed by the three respondents, Professor Anderson, Professor Gourevitch, Professor Sawyer, and in that order. Each respondent will have about 10 or 12 minutes to deliver their comments, followed by a response by Professor Honneth to his respondents for about 10 minutes. After that, we will start the question and answer session, starting with a quick comments by the three discussants, respondents. As for the question and answer session, please raise your hands by using the reaction button on your screen or send a message to Behailu indicating that you wish to ask a question by using the chat function. You may also write out a question in the chat for Behailu to read to the audience at large and to the relevant panelists. That covers everything in terms of the protocols. Now the introduction. This is the hardest part, that is introducing scholars who are well known, yet the ritual needs to be done, but I will shrink the ritual to a minimum. Professor Honneth is Jack C. Weinstein Professor of Humanities in the Department of Philosophy at the Columbia University. Prior to coming to Columbia, he was a C4 Professor of Social Philosophy at Goethe University at Frankfurt, where he also served as the director of the Institute for Social Research for more than 2 decades, and he remains closely associated with that distinguished institute. Earlier in his career in the 1980s, Professor Honneth worked closely with Jürgen Habermas as his scientific assistant on numerous research projects, and later, with the passing of the years, he became a leading voice and representative of contemporary critical theory. Honneth's research covers a wide range of topics in social and political philosophy, as evident from more than a dozen books and hundreds of articles he has published over nearly 4 decades. I will mention just 4 books, influential books here, aside from the book being discussed here today. The Critique of Power, The Reflective Stages in a Critical Social Theory, The Struggle for Recognition, The Moral Grammar of Social Conflicts, Disrespect, Normative Foundations of Critical Theory, and Freedom's Right. Not surprisingly, he is a recipient of numerous awards, of which, once again, I will mention only 3. In 2015, he received the Ernst Bloch Prize from the city of Ludwigshafen in Germany. In 2016, he received Bruno Kreisky Award Prize from Karl Renner Foundation in Vienna. And the same year, he also was awarded Ulysses Medal from University College Dublin for the highest honor, their highest honor for his lifetime contribution to social philosophy and critical theory. Next, I will introduce the respondents. The first respondent is Professor Elizabeth Anderson. She holds multiple named professorships at the University of Michigan, Max Shays Professor of Public Philosophy, John Dewey Distinguished University Professor, and Arthur F. Thurnau Professor. Professor Elizabeth Anderson specializes in moral, social, and political philosophy, feminist theory, social epistemology, philosophy of economics, and social sciences. She is particularly interested in exploring the interaction of social sciences with moral and political theory, how we learn to improve our value judgment, the epistemic function of emotions and democratic deliberation, and issues of race, gender, and equality. In addition to numerous scholarly articles on these topics, Professor Anderson has published following books: Value in Ethics and Economics, The Imperative of Integration, Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. And most recently, Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Worker Can Take It Back. She is currently working on the history of egalitarianism. As for awards, unavoidable as they are, Professor Anderson is a MacArthur Fellow, a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a Fellow of the British Academy. Our second respondent is Alex Gourevitch. He's an Associate Professor of Political Science in the Department of Political Science at Brown University. After receiving his doctorate at Columbia University in 2010, Alex was postdoctoral research fellow at Brown University and College of Fellow at Harvard University, and subsequently taught at the McMaster University in Canada before returning to Brown University. Professor Gourevitch's research interests include history of political and economic thought, theories of freedom, work and leisure, Marxism, rights theory, republicanism, and democratic theory. He is the author of the From Slavery to Cooperative Commonwealth, Labor and Republican Liberty in the 19th Century, published in 2015, which masterfully embeds and tracks the career of a political idea, Republican liberty, in a historical narrative of a cooperative labor movement, that of the Knights of Labor. Gourevitch is currently working on a book on the political theory of strikes. He is also a political commentator. In that capacity, he writes regularly for publications like Jacobin, Dissent, Salon, and runs a critical economy blog called The Current Moment. Finally, our third respondent is Professor Stephen Sawyer. He's a Ballantine Leavitt Professor of History and Director of the Center for Critical Democratic Studies. During the final years of his doctorate at the University of Chicago and in its aftermath, he spent a great deal of time in Paris doing research, teaching at École Normale Supérieure, holding series of fellowships at EHES, Fulbright, and Sciences Po, and also served as a part-time assistant to Pierre Rosanvallon at the Collège de France. While he has written numerous articles on a wide range of topics in the intellectual history of political ideas, his core project in 3 volumes articulates the history and the theory of democracy as a mode of popular magistracy, administration, and public regulation. The project involved a critical intellectual history featuring close reading of key texts and authors, a mode of reading that yields surprisingly different results when one places democracy rather than liberalism or republicanism at the center of history of political modernity. First volume of this project was published in 2018, titled Demos Assembled, Democracy and the International Origins of the Modern State, 1840 to 1880. Second volume, Demos Rising, Democracy and the Popular Construction of Public Power in France, 1800 to 1850, was published this month by the University of Chicago Press. He is currently working on the third and concluding volume, Demos Unbound, Democracy and the Construction of Modern Administrative State in the French Revolution. he goes backward. He has served as the director of publications of Tocqueville Review since 2014, and in that capacity, he has also founded an online platform called Tocqueville 21. With that, I conclude the introductions, and I will hand this over to Professor Axel Honneth to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Professor Axel Honneth.
Yeah, I start by thanking you, Dilip, very much for the invitation to present my book in this distinguished circle of people and academics. I also would like to thank my respondents, my distinguished respondents, for having been willing to read my book and to comment on it. And I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm a little bit overwhelmed by the many names of people I know that I would like to greet everyone, which I will not do, because we have a very strict protocol, and I hope to be able to keep the 20-minute limit that was set to my short summary of my book. So I did my best to give a summary. I didn't do that before, and I found it extremely difficult, as every author will easily imagine, to summarize a book on which you worked for 3 years or even longer, and then to present it in 20 minutes. But as I said, I will do my best to do exactly that. The topic of my book is the connection between the social division of labor and political democracy. I start from the premise that by allotting very different positions and occupations to different individuals, the division of labor determines to a high degree the extent to which each person can influence the process of political will formation. To ignore this precondition of a democratic society is, so I want to show, a central blind spot in political philosophical accounts of democratic justice. I'm definitely not the first one to make such a claim. There were many, many before me making such a claim. I only mentioned from the earlier period John Dewey, who was keen on making that point, J.D.H. Cole from the British Labour Movement, who made this point very convincingly. From a younger generation, there is Carol Pateman, Robert Dahl, and many others, some sitting here and some being respondents today. But I think, given the degree to which work and working conditions are ignored today within political liberalism and democratic theory, it seems very urgent to repeat this earlier lesson with new arguments and adjust it to the new neoliberal conditions. My book is made up of 3 main parts and 2 excursus. The first part or section consists of an attempt to justify the normative perspective from which I think the existing work relations can best be criticized. The second section tries to summarize historical and sociological literature to reconstruct in broad strikes the development of capitalist work since the early 19th century up to the present day. In order to get a fair enough and comprehensive enough view of this historical development, I place in front of my historical chapter an excursus in which I try to clarify the notion of work or labor. What are the social activities we can justifiably referring to when we speak of the organization of work. So simply, it's a difficult but simple question. To what kind of activities in a society do we refer when we are using the notion work and working conditions? Surely there are activities that seem necessary to us. There are other activities that seem less necessary for social reproduction, for example. And I want simply to clarify the notion of work. Let me just see here. The third section of my book, I was now speaking about the first part on the normative question, the second part, the historical reconstruction. The third part of my book is about a contemporary politics of labor. What needs to be done, what needs to be fought for, either by a renewed labor movement or by a political party, to improve the existing working conditions in such a way that the normative conditions I set out in my first normative section can be fulfilled or are fulfilled. In order to get a broad enough perspective on what can be done and fought for in such political struggles, I also place in front of this last third political section an excursus where I want to demonstrate that the existing division of labor is much more open to changes and revisions than we normally think, due to some overly voluntaristic or deterministic views of it. So this is the very rough overview on the structure of the book. As I said, 3 chapters, and they are bridged by 2 excursus. Let me now briefly try to summarize the main thesis of the 3 chapters and the 2 excursus. In my first normative section, I sketch 3 normative perspectives from which the capitalist work relations have been criticized and can be criticized. Critics have argued that the existing capitalist organization of work firstly estranges or alienates labor or the workers. That is what I call the Marxist paradigm of criticism. Secondly, it is argued that the capitalist conditions of work denies autonomy and make the workers dependent on arbitrary decisions by private employers. I call this paradigm the Republican paradigm. Or thirdly, it is argued that the capitalist working condition fails to support political democracy and inclusion of all citizens in the democratic process. I call this third paradigm the democratic paradigm. So these are 3 different normative perspectives that I differentiate in order to get an overview on the kind of criticism possible to direct against our capitalistic working conditions. It is a very complicated task to evaluate the merits and flaws of these 3 paradigms. So I have to be very short here. The Marxist paradigm of estrangement or alienation, in maintaining that work can only be non-alienating when allowing the expression or realization of human capacities, is, in my view, either too under-demanding or too over-demanding, depending exactly on what we mean by human capacities. Too under-demanding when what is meant by such capacities are all the capacities we have as human beings, because then all kinds of work require such human capacities, starting from the most poorest kind of work up to the most complicated works. They all, for sure, represent or allow or even require the expression of some of our human capacities. This paradigm is too over-demanding when what is meant by human capacities refers only to certain extravagant capacities or abilities like creativity or aesthetic expression, because then only very few occupations will ever be able to fulfill such a criterion. The Republican paradigm, and we have some representatives, as I can see here among us and even among the discussants, the Republican paradigm that maintains that decisions concerning the working conditions should be determined by the workers, or at least co-determined by them, is in my view underinformative because it abstracts from the many social harms to workers resulting from a low esteem for the kind of occupation or from a too narrowly confined area of occupational activity. This, I guess, will be a point of our discussion. So in consequence of these critical points, I favor the third democratic paradigm that maintains that working conditions are fairly and well enough organized only when they allow all employees to make effectively use of their democratic rights and to participate without shame and anxiety at the democratic will formation. Spelling this criteria out, I developed in an engagement with Rawls and Habermas 5 minimal conditions that have to be fulfilled when real-life work conditions are to support democratic participation in a full sense. They have, and now I list these 5 conditions, they have to guarantee economic independence, first. Secondly, they have to allow enough free time for political activity. Third, they have to help ensure a measure of self-respect and self-esteem. Fourth, they have to offer a practical side to practice democracy and help to provide its necessary skills. And fifth, it has to encompass on the level of each occupation a sufficient variety of activities and tasks to avoid becoming psychologically debilitating. In the rest of my book, I work with these 5 conditions to evaluate existing working conditions and to envision political measures to improve them. In my first excursus, I raise the question of what kind of activities in a society we can justifiably refer to as necessary work when we talk about working conditions and their improvement. I thought this step would be necessary because there is a strong tendency in our political philosophical tradition since Locke and continuing in Marx to reduce such work only to the production or fabrication of goods and thus to industrial labor, thereby excluding all unpaid work in households, all care and service work in private or public institutions, and even sometimes agricultural labor. In order to overcome this one-sidedness of our traditional understanding of work, I propose a definition which I hope is broad enough to encompass all the activities necessary for social reproduction at a given time, without excluding any longer what might be called, without including what might be called private activities or hobbies. That's the real difficulty in defining what work could mean, not to make it too broad, to include all kinds of activities, and to make it, on the other side, broad enough to include activities that long were ignored in our accounts of what work means. We should call all those activities work in a society that its social community takes as being necessary for the reproduction or maintenance of all the elements understood by this community as valuable in their cultural life form. This is in the shortest way the definition I try to come up with. So maybe I repeat it, yeah? So we should call all activities work in a society that its community takes as being necessary for the maintenance of all the elements understood as valuable in its cultural life form. That is an extremely broad definition, and it has probably the flaw not being able to come up with proposals what we can concerning bullshit jobs or something like that. I think these are questions that can be only solved politically in political conflicts and debates, but shouldn't be pre-decided by political philosophy. In the second section of my book, I want to show in a kind of broad historical reconstruction that the capitalist organization of work since the early 19th century, including now care and service work, has regularly failed to pass the test I have earlier established by my 5 conditions. Despite some improvements in salary, social security, and co-determination, achieved particularly in Western Europe until the neoliberal setbacks, existing working conditions are, on the average, still far away from allowing workers a full and effective use of their political liberties and thus an unrestricted participation at the democratic will formation. So, I mean, this takes at least a third of my book, this kind of historical reconstruction, but I only give you this little indication of what it entails. It tries to go in some details, and it also tries, which is extremely difficult, to cover these underestimated kinds of work, yeah, like service work, care work, cooking, household work, and all this, which made it difficult, but also extremely challenging and interesting. With regard to my second excursus, which I mentioned before, let me only mention that I there try to reject commonplace views of it, the division of labor, as resting either merely on free choice or as technologically necessary. There is no iron law regulating the division of labor that prevents a far-reaching reshaping of the format of occupations, because most of it is decided by political and social struggles. So I use a lot of literature, mainly from industrial sociology and from social theory, to demonstrate that we tend to have a too fixed view of the division of labor, not seeing that much in it is determined not by technological necessities and definitely not by free choice of individuals, but is determined by social conflicts, economic competition, and all this. So it has a deeply political side in it, or to it. In order to inform and encourage such struggles, in the final political section of my book, I outline the contours of a democratic politics of labor. Such a politics, I argue, in the first step, should be skeptical about calls for a universal basic income, not only because of concerns about its practical feasibility, but mainly because of its social consequences in accelerating the process of individualization and and turning citizens into mere clients of an ever-expanding state apparatus. My task concludes with two subchapters. My book concludes with two subchapters in which I make proposals concerning the two levels that the democratic politics of labor has at its disposal. In the search for alternatives to the labor market, it should engage in promoting experiments, social experiments, with workers' cooperatives, an instrument that John Stuart Mill already saw as the single best way of ensuring the inclusion of workers into the democratic process. So this is a chapter where I talk a lot about the difficulties such workers' cooperatives are confronted with today, the little help and support they get normally from states in order to survive in a capitalistic environment, and also the internal difficulties they have to stabilize themselves. However, since this strategy, the strategy of experimentation with workers' cooperatives, and we know such experiments, for example, from former Yugoslavia, the main example for trying to establish workers' cooperatives. However, since this strategy is not sufficiently supported either by states or the majority of the population in our democratic countries at the moment, I then turn to proposals for reforms within the labor market. So I differentiate between these two strategies, either to search for alternatives to the labor market, and I mentioned some more than only workers' cooperatives, or to search for reforms within the labor market. An essential starting point for any such reforms is an updated constitutionalization of work that claws back rights and protections workers have lost during the dramatic recent changes in the neoliberal reshaping of employment laws and working conditions. This is mainly true for Western Europe, I have to say. At least in Western Europe, the labor movement was relatively successful in establishing quite serious protections and social security instruments in order to constitutionalize work. These laws were in most of Western European countries taken back over the last 20, 30 years. So the first step, I think, for a strategy of internal reforms within the labor market is kind of reconstitutionalization of work, which means to take back rights and protections that were already established. But in addition to this most basic and important level for improving the social conditions within the labor market, many other reforms seem necessary, bearing in mind my 5 conditions. Attempts to democratize workplaces by extending co-determination rights at the 2 levels of management and labor on the ground. Attempts to revise indirectly through public argument and persuasion the evaluative system by which the social value and importance of occupations and tasks are currently measured, and finally attempt to support struggles to redesign purely demanding occupations in such a way that they become more complex, mentally more challenging, and psychologically more satisfying. That is the last conclusion I draw in my book. I know that this may sound like the wish list of an academic far removed from the day-to-day conflicts within workplaces and far removed from any serious conflicts within the unions have with our existing working conditions. But it is intended, this list, as a guide outlining points of orientation for a renewed democratic politics of labor to come. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Honneth. And now we turn the floor over to Professor Elizabeth Anderson of University of Michigan.
Thank you. First, I just want to express how thrilled I was, Axel, to read your book. I think it is the most persuasive and comprehensive contemporary argument for the importance of reconstructing the division of labor and the organization of work for democracy. So I think it's just huge. I'm very, very happy that you've put this problem on the political agenda and so clearly connected the conditions and organization of work to our ability to renew and sustain democracy at the state level. I also take on board entirely your 5 conditions for what's needed for work to be able to cultivate the attitudes and skills required for democratic participation. All of these are really fabulous. What I want to do is just raise a couple of arguments. One, I want to use an entree by considering my dissertation advisor, John Rawls. If you actually read him carefully and closely, you will discover that Rawls actually does apply the difference principle to the division of labor. It's very subtle. He doesn't draw out the implications of this. One of his other former graduate students, Sam Freeman, I think has done the most constructive work in this realm. But Rawls is quite clear that primary goods include positions of power and responsibility at work. And the difference principle applies to the division of labor. So inequalities in power and responsibilities, like the kinds of skills and needed and so forth, have to be justified in terms of improving the position, maximizing the position of the least advantaged. There's no way that the current division of labor with radical inequalities in powers and responsibilities and the skill demands could remotely be justified by that criterion. I think Rawls's application of Rawls's principles would actually require the elimination of work that's been reduced to pure drudgery, and that excludes any opportunities for exercising judgment and autonomy at work. In addition, I think it's clear that we have to connect distributive justice in terms of income and wealth also to the democratizing project at work. Rawls himself saw a very direct connection between more equal distributions of political power. It's mediated by the power of money to affect who gets to run candidates, lobbying, campaign finance, and so forth. His argument there is not mediated by concerns about work. However, in my own explorations of work, I have another concern, which I think has to be put on the table. So in my most recent book, Hijacked, How Neoliberalism Turned the Work Ethic Against Workers and How Workers Can Take It Back, I do an entire history and rewrite the history of the Protestant work ethic and show that, in fact, there are 2 work ethic traditions, one of which led to today's neoliberal capitalism, but the other one led to social democracy. And critically here, the capitalist work ethic from the beginning was explicitly based on promoting conspicuous consumption as a mode of esteemed competition and as a way to get workers to work really hard, right? And that's what neoliberalism gives us, right? We have a consumer society, people working really hard to earn more money so that they could show off their wealth through consumption. The rise of internet influencers is really just propelling that esteemed competition even further. Now, there is a Rawlsian solution to this, which is that if you radically compress the differences in consumption possibilities between the top and the bottom of society, there's just a lot less room to, pursue esteemed competition through conspicuous consumption. And in fact, what you tend to get is a much more egalitarian ethos on the consumer end. You can pair that with an interesting argument by Fred Block in his recently published book, The Habitation Society. Block points out that modern finance is based on a franchise model, that is, the power of the state to produce money has been franchised out to commercial banks. However, if you look at what commercial banks do, almost none of their activity is involved with servicing the real economy. It's almost all financial transactions are devoted to speculation on financial assets, where the finance industry is just servicing its own speculative interests. And Block argues in the Habitation Society that that the state should take back that franchising power from commercial banks, or at least radically reduce it, because commercial banks no longer really, most of their activity isn't really needed or useful or productive. And you can redirect the franchising power to things like community banks that would service nonprofits, and alternative modes of service provision, community service organizations, the expansion of the nonprofit sector, and perhaps I would say also we should experiment with helping out benefit corporations, which have an explicit social aim, although they also make profits. The second point I want to make has to do with experimentation with alternative work designs. And indeed, some of this is going on and is worth, an Eric Olin Wright style grounded exploration of real utopias. And I just want to mention a couple models that I think are very useful for this project of redividing the labor. So one is the Buurtzorg model of neighborhood care work. This was invented in the Netherlands. It's gaining traction in other countries. In this model, you have autonomous teams of nurses, and social workers collect together and help out people who need in-home care. And what's important here is that on the standard capitalist model of in-home nursing care, enormous amounts of time are devoted to filling out paperwork to document effort. And most of the demands are placed on maximizing the number of individuals served, which minimizes the amount of time, and most importantly, the amount of relational work that can take place if all you're doing is servicing minimum needs. On the Buurtzorg model, you get rid of the paperwork, the supervision, the bureaucratization. This is a professionalized team that cares about actually helping people rather than maximizing profits. And they work together, building relationships between the people needing care, their family members, community members who also might be involved, building those relationships, consulting with the people who need care and their family caretakers, what everybody needs, what would be most helpful. And then they think creatively about how to create systems of social support that will enhance the capabilities of the individuals receiving care, and as well relieve some of the burdens from immediate family members. And much of this creative thinking about the redesign of care work has also been advanced by a wonderful person. Hilary Cottam has this wonderful book called Radical Care, in which she envisions radical redesigns of social work, care, and service work. And she does experiments with redesigning this work. She's working in the UK, helping municipalities redesign social services work. And again, this involves creating multidisciplinary teams of people who are helping out families that are suffering from any number of deficits, capability deficits, children who are not doing well in school or have dropped out and maybe resorted to crime, drug addiction, long-term unemployment and the inability to find jobs, just radical disorganization of family life. And she creates multidisciplinary teams to rethink how to help these people with a focus, number one, on building networks of social relationships that will, and number two, enhancing the capabilities of the people being served rather than being reduced simply to meeting basic biological needs of the family members. A lot of this work also involves recruiting retirees and other people who could volunteer and overcome their own difficulties of loneliness. But it's a really, she's doing a lot of experimentation with completely revising social services work that is state funded or publicly funded. And finally, I just want to point out, I know from personal experience from my own daughter who's working at a community mental health center in Worcester, Massachusetts, that this model of bringing in peer counselors who themselves have suffered from mental health problems. They're not professionals, but they counsel other people who come into the community mental health center looking for support and ways to cope. And her organization has been remarkably creative in inventing new ways of helping people. And again, that's the kind of thing where it's fulfilling work. Some of the workers are paid. My daughter is working on opening up access to Medicare and Medicaid payment for peer counselors. But the critical issue here is that these kinds of organizations build community relationships and experiences of mutual responsibility in scaling up care, not just isolated within the family unit, but on a more community basis. There's a lot of room to fund that rather than spending all that money creation merely on, speculation of zero value added assets like cryptocurrency and so forth. Okay, so I think we have a lot of room here for experimentation. Some of these experiments are already being undertaken and I think have very promising possibilities attached to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Anderson. And now we move on to our second discussant, Alex Gourevitch. Here we go. The floor
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be part of this panel, especially since Professor Honneth has written such a timely and important book. I agree with Professor Honneth that the division of labor is not treated with enough depth and systematic thinking in political theory, and that the organization of work is not just one issue out of many, it is foundational. But foundational in what way? Because there are various ways one might make that case. So I want to focus on the specificity of Professor Honneth's argument. And as I see it, his argument is really bidirectional. So from one direction, he argues that the democratic perspective is the most persuasive standpoint from which to criticize and reimagine the division of labor. And so he pits, as you heard, his democratic theoretical approach against alternatives like the Marxist concern with alienation or neo-Republican criticisms of domination. And then from the other direction, he tells us that an empirically grounded understanding of the current organization of work can expand the normative concerns that a democratic theorist might have. And what comes out of this bidirectional dialectic is Professor Honneth's basic claim, which I'll just restate as I understood it, which is that the central wrong with the organization of work is that it undermines the willingness and capacity of citizens to participate as equals in political life. So, as he variously puts it, the current organization of work, quote, brings with it mental and cultural disadvantages for the working population that may prevent individuals from exercising their right to political participation. And then from there, he generates the series of reforms that you heard, both alternatives to the labor market like cooperatives and improvements to the labor market like labor sharing, employee voice, and free time. Now, I'm very sympathetic to the broad project of democratizing the economy, but I am forced by that same sympathy to voice some serious doubts about Professor Honneth's approach. So, for instance, he repeatedly says in the book that part of what makes his approach practical in a normative sense, as something we ought to do, is that it is realistic. And realism here has a specific double meaning for Professor Honneth. First, realism refers to the thought that his normative position articulates the real or actual aspirations of existing subjects, people, which he observes in what he calls, quote, the places where the quiet resistance of the working sovereign is to be found, end quote. So we do not live in a time of mass worker rebellion, but there is plenty of foot dragging and other kinds of individualized resistance to current arrangements, and that resistance expresses desires for alternatives which can serve as an immanent foundation for the democratic demands that he articulates. And then second, realism refers to the fact that his proposals are feasible given current political constraints. We do not live in a moment of great political possibility, which must be incorporated into our thinking about what we ought to do. And this concern with feasibility is one reason why early in the book he rejects the utopian thoughts of Marx-inspired alienation theorists, and why at the end of the book he concludes with what he calls, quote, a dose of Weber's realism. Or as he puts it, quote, in our era of inertia, the political agenda I have outlined here has no reason to display excessive self-confidence or show overweening revolutionary ambition. However, on its own terms, it seems to me that Professor Honneth's realism seems exceedingly unrealistic. So while he professes no overweening revolutionary ambitions, in the book, once he follows the logic of his own proposals through, it becomes clear at various points that his modest reforms involve quite significant politically controversial changes to the organization of work. Consider just a few examples. So on page 148, we learn that one absolute democratic necessity is state conscription, quote, compelling every fit and able member of society, including presumably the sons and daughters of the wealthy, to spend a short period of their life, end quote, working in what he calls socially necessary menial or other not widely respected occupations, such as, quote, geriatric nurses, hospital staff, or social workers. Then on page 157, we learn that Professor Honneth's improvements to the labor market, quote, imply substantial limitations on entrepreneurial freedom. On page 168, he tells us that a realistic democratic theory requires resistance to the current, quote, trend towards cost-cutting rationalization, end quote, in workplace organization, which would be required to facilitate the cooperatives. Now, taken together, this ensemble of proposals involves a major challenge to the wealth and prerogatives of the rich and to the power of the owning and employing classes. And I can see no reason why they would not resist with all their resources and might these reforms. I just don't think Elon Musk, Rishi Sunak, or Dieter Schwartz are going to tolerate their children being forced to change bedpans. And they'll have the support of large numbers of wealthy or even modestly well-off people. I think the business class is going to mind limitations on their entrepreneurial freedoms or on their capacity to engage in profitable cost-cutting. Yet, as Professor Honneth himself observes in the book, there is no well-organized militant movement that could overcome that predictable organized resistance to his proposals. In which case, Despite the formal modesty of his proposals, I fail to see how any of them are feasible. It's true that when compared with revolution or more radical social transformation, his reforms are less totalizing, but that does not make them more realistic. If anything, I worry it betrays a kind of false modesty. He sort of presents the reforms as feasible because they are limited and piecemeal, but he does not really acknowledge the political challenge facing any political theory of work, namely, who has the power to overcome the significant resistance from conservative forces and introduce the relevant normatively required reforms. And I would press this concern even further, which is that for a book that is so admirably and impressively empirically grounded in the sociological realities of contemporary work life, there is, for me, startlingly little discussion of class structure or class power. But it seems to me no normatively compelling immanent critique of current work structures can be evasive about the current distribution of power, the different group interests at stake, and who the relevant agents of transformation are. Yet the proposals are rather vague on where collective social power comes from to do this. To be clear, this is not just some kind of empirical point about whether Professor Honneth's proposals are feasible. It informs the entire self-limiting normative perspective of the book. After all, imagine a solution to the aforementioned political problem were to appear. Imagine that a well-organized labor movement and a disciplined political party really were in a position to overcome conservative resistance and impose Professor Honneth's proposals. Why would they stop there? As an empirical matter, a well-organized labor movement with sustained political power would be unlikely to limit itself to reforms that improve the quality of democratic participation. They might want to socialize investment, socialize finance, redistribute wealth and ownership, and introduce other forms of democratic socialism, which means the only reason they would stop from doing any of that would be because they ought to stop, that they ought to self-limit. But why, once more dramatic change is feasible, ought they to stop at such modest changes? So to put this sort of theoretical problem another way, either even Professor Honneth's modest proposals are very infeasible because they presuppose a powerful democratic agent able to overcome business class resistance that does not exist, or his proposals are too self-limiting normatively speaking, because once there is an agent that makes these proposals feasible, there is no good normative reason why anyone ought to limit their horizons. This is not really political realism. It seems to me it is, as I said, or I worry, a kind of false modesty, a doctrine of unwarranted restraint. Which brings me then to the kind of my final thoughts about what we ought to want from the organization of work in the first place. So let us imagine again that we really were in position to organize work as it ought to be, because we or someone has the social power to do so. I can't see why we would limit ourselves normatively, intellectually, aspirational to the instrumental concern with the effect of work on democratic participation. It is undoubtedly true that one of the wrongs of the capitalist division of labor is that it undermines democratic participation by some groups of workers. I agree with that. But even here, I think the major problem from a democratic point of view is not the mental and cultural limitations on workers, or that work imposes on workers, but just the unequal and undemocratic power of employers and managers and owners to constrain workers from participating. Workers just don't have the freedoms they ought to have to speak, assemble, and vote because of the managerial prerogatives of bosses and employer control over them. Those who don't have to work for a boss are much freer to speak their mind, engage in public life, act and participate without fear of being fired, and so on, than those who have to work for a living. And they also have all kinds of other directly political power in their control over investment that workers don't have. So even thinking democratically, I think the primary concern with the economy is just the wildly unequal power that some people have over the organization of production. But to get there, we have to think of work centrally as just its own site of politics. For instance, the way neo-Republicans think along that line that Professor Honneth disagrees with. So it's a site in which some have power and authority over others, not just an activity that might have negative effects on the capacity to participate outside work. But the further and kind of ultimate point is that work is not or does not need to be understood as a purely instrumental activity. It is neither merely a means to producing things others need, nor to making democratic participation possible. It is its own distinctive form of human activity, a site of self-development and individuation, potentially an activity worth doing for its own sake, but under the right conditions. Conditions that, among other things, give all a fair opportunity to develop their talents, engage in activities worthy of their efforts, in conditions that respect their equal freedom. And I just can see no principled or practical reason for shying away from thinking about work along the lines of the traditions that Professor Honneth rejects in the early parts of the book. Namely, those traditions that try to understand the conditions under which our productive contributions are meaningful, self-determining, and good in themselves. Conditions in which each of us would find contributing our time and abilities to be an essential freedom we have reason to exercise for its own sake, independent of any instrumental benefit it might have. And should we ever be in a position in which our ideas would indeed be practical on a national scale, where our ideals possible because we have the power to put them into effect, I think those are the kinds of thoughts we would want to have ready to hand. But I wish to thank Professor Honneth for such a provocative and stimulating book.
Thank you, Professor Gourevitch. And now we move on to the finals respondent, Professor Stephen Sawyer.
Thank you, Dilip, and thank you for this opportunity. It is indeed a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss this book in such distinguished company. So I have been an avid follower of Professor Honneth's work for many years. So part of what I'd like to do is just sort of situate how I understand a small part of how I understand this this book fitting into some of his other work, in particular, some references to freedom's right and the idea of socialism, and to think about the history of democracy and the politics of work as sites where will formation takes place from a historical perspective. Let me just reiterate, I am speaking as a historian here who has found, in Professor Honneth's work, a powerful theoretical framework for thinking in fresh ways about sort of the history of democracy, especially in the 19th century. So I'd like to talk as well a little bit about the uses of history and sort of this reconstructive project in Professor Honneth's book here. So the Working Sovereign is obviously an important clarion call for an urgent rethinking of the social division of labor in modern capitalism for the 21st century. At the heart of the proposal is the attempt to renew the ideal of free labor by moving it beyond, as we've already talked about, these two dominant paradigms of the Marxian and the Republican. To find this third way, Professor Honneth looks toward Hegel and Durkheim. He mentioned Cole earlier and Dewey, but Durkheim sort of has a very prominent position in this book to uncover a democratic ideal of social labor, which fosters a theory of work designed to, and I quote, facilitate an intrinsic good, namely the greatest possible and most effective participation of all members of society in the processes of democratic self-determination, unquote. Now, so my comments will sort of focus on this move from Hegel to Durkheim. Professor Honneth has previously drawn particular attention to Hegel's claim in The Philosophy of Right that a proper and thoroughgoing freedom can only be achieved through a coordination of three realms of intersubjectivity, civil society, and the state. In his idea of socialism, Professor Honneth further argues, I quote, that the process of democratic will formation is central to the principle of social freedom, integrating a respect for basic individual rights, intersubjective freedom, and democratic will formation, he argues, might just provide the necessary path to renewal for socialism. So I read The Working Sovereign as grappling with another central aspect of the project, in many ways following directly on the idea of socialism, that is, after providing a kind of foundational social theory and freedom's right and clearing a path toward a broader rethinking of socialism, The Working Sovereign sort of tackles the central subject of that discussion, or rather how to reconceptualize labor in this project of social emancipation. which to a large extent requires abandoning the blinkered view of workers' movements born in the mid-19th century. And in the idea of socialism, there's a real emphasis on this period, let's say the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, is contributing to a rather blinkered view of worker movements. And I see that echoed here. So Professor Honneth in this book starts with a capacious reading of Hegel's notion of freedom. Hegel offers a foundation for a political liberty within the workplace because he situates the social division of labor within a complex field of socially recognized and varied forms of employment. As central as Hegel's fundamental assertion was, however, Hegel was notoriously skeptical of democracy and democratic will formation. So it's here, as in previous works, that Professor Honneth needs to turn to other thinkers and largely later 19th and early 20th century thinkers such as John Dewey Cole and Durkheim. Durkheim's social division of labor in particular is placed within a larger normative commitment to democracy, offering the possibility that socialists, I quote, interpret liberal rights to freedom not as a restriction, but as a necessary condition for economic social freedoms. Now, we're not disoriented. If we're familiar with Professor Honneth's work, we're not disoriented by the cast of characters here. The move from Hegel to political and social theory of the late 19th century continues a theme in the previous works. Given the exigencies and constraints necessarily imposed on a project of this scope, I don't want to overinterpret what I see here as a kind of chronological gap between Hegel on the one hand and Durkheim and Dewey in the period around Durkheim and Dewey on the other. So I don't want to overstate that. I do wonder, I suppose, if it doesn't reveal a certain skepticism that I think is clearer in the idea of socialism of the period stretching from the early reception of Hegel, perhaps dominated by Marx, especially in the 1830s through 60s, when a certain idea of socialism and the workers' movement took place that Professor Honneth seems to be pushing against. In any case, it seems to me that there is a rather consistent chronology in at least recent work of this overarching project that, intentionally or not, sort of sets this period aside. So you sort of see me coming. So this sort of opens the door to a more historical question of how some of the thinkers who were situated in this period, which is the period sort of that much of my work has focused on, in these middle decades of the 19th century might inform our reading of this book and perhaps portions of the project. That is, are there some resources in this period that might help us to better understand the transition from Hegel to Durkheim, and thus might help us understand how the democratization of a social division of labor emerged, what it was responding against? And I think to some extent and I don't want to overread, but there seems to be sort of an implicit sense that of the democratic limitations of this previous period that are kind of overcome in the late 19th and 20th century social science. So I'm drawing here on a chapter in my book that appeared just last week entitled Workplace Democracy that focuses specifically on questions of the democratization of Hegelian notions of regulatory police and corporations in the 1830s through 50s. So let me just say a word about this. And since Professor Honneth himself makes gainful use of literature in his book, I'll do so by way of a passage in Flaubert's L'Éducation sentimentale. So here's the passage. So some of you may be familiar with this passage. So after climbing a staircase in a provincial porcelain factory, the radical democratic socialist Sénécal opened a door to find a room filled with women workers. In the corner, and despite factory regulations, which in France in the 19th century were required to be posted on the wall of small factories, these regulations forbid, I quote, eating in the workshops for reasons of cleanliness and hygiene for the workers. Sénécal, this radical democratic socialist, sees a woman with an open bottle of wine and some charcuterie next to her on the table as she works. And Sénécal, Flaubert says, either out of duty or despotism, cries out to the woman and points toward the placard on the wall with the list of regulations and screams, "Read Article 9 out loud to me." And she responds proudly, "What for?" And Sénécal responds, "So that you may know why you will be paying a 3 franc fine." Bemused, the woman worker responded, "Why should I care? When the owner returns, he will remove your fine, and I don't give a damn about you, mon bonhomme." And she quickly returns to work, snubbing the arbitrary intervention of this awkward visitor. Having witnessed the exchange, Sénécal's friend, Frédéric, one of the lead characters of the book, looks at him and exclaims, "You are quite severe for a Democrat." To which Sénécal responds, "Democracy is not wanton individualism. It is equality before the law, the distribution of work, and order!" Exclamation point. Recognizing Sénécal's democratic convictions, but still unimpressed by his despotic tendencies, Frédéric responds, "Yes, but you forgot about humanity." So this scene from Flaubert's Éducation sentimentale offers a surprising account of workplace democracy in the 1840s in some ways, in comparison to perhaps some of the ways you might imagine that period to be functioning in the account that we have in The Working Sovereign. And there's sort of two themes that I'd like to bring out and will lead to, in conclusion, will lead to my question on this period that's sort of situated between Hegel and Durkheim. So the first theme is that regulations of the workplace were understood to be part of the democratic revolution underway in the middle decades of the 19th century. That is, they were understood to be part of a political revolution, not just a social revolution. Now, here the work of Alain Cottereau on what he refers to as bon droit, which has a difficult translation into English. It's been translated as a sense of justice in labor, is particularly important. Flaubert's passage suggests that the workers of the mid-19th century did not necessarily see themselves as submissive agents. And Cottereau has highlighted how throughout France, regulations and work contracts were understood to be necessarily founded on local labor regulations, which were established in dialogue and litigated in courts, elected partially by the workers themselves, courts known as the prud'homme, which still exist but have changed quite a bit since the 19th century, and that's part of the issue. So this bon droit was ultimately replaced in the 1880s, 1890s, when Durkheim was writing, by statute law of employment. This new statute law, and I quote Cottereau here, replaced the principle of bilateral free wills, which characterized bon droit, by a principle of protection as a counterpart of imperative industrial subservience. So for Cottereau, this sort of period of labor law that emerges at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century sort of replaces an actual process of democratic will formation and confronts it with this new kind of exchange between protection on the one hand, but industrial subservience on the other, which he says was not a factor of mid-19th century regulatory practices. Now, and then the second theme in this passage, beyond the mere fact of expanding and implementing further regulations, workplace democracy depended on how these regulations were enforced. So in Flaubert's account, the woman's refusal to recognize Sénécal's authority and her conviction that the owner himself would not enforce Sénécal's intervention, and Frédéric's surprise at Sénécal's despotism, all attest that what was in question was neither the regulations nor their democratic nature, but the arbitrary way in which they were being enforced. In this sense, the workplace and the institutions designed to manage its regulatory structure were considered democratic, in the words of the actors of the novel, for the way they contributed to elaborating technologies of democratic government in which paternal and providential responsibilities of the state were downscaled and handled by those who were most directly concerned. It was precisely the attempts to redefine the means of regulatory police that empowered workers and helped forge a new ideal of workplace democracy. Now, to return and to conclude, in The Working Sovereign, Professor Honneth sees in Durkheim's social division of labor the possibility of integrating society around individual labor activities. That is, as I understand it, the social division of labor gives meaning to the profound variety of forms of social labor by insisting on the relationship between all of its forms, and thus it becomes a means of introducing opportunities to see labor as a mode of democratic will formation, precisely because it is situated in its full relationship to other members of the political community. Now, as others have expressed, I am deeply sympathetic to this idea, but it seems to me that sort of trying to travel the historical distance now between Durkheim and our present, we also need to historicize Durkheim's notion of social integration through a social division of labor within the particular moment of its formulation. That is, Durkheim was participating in the massive democratic upscaling beyond local forms of organization that dominated regulatory police, administrative power, and norms of work in much of the 19th century. His social division of labor grew out of the articulation of a democratic generality at the scale of the nation state, which I should add also largely neglected the French Empire. It thus came at a time when social integration was undermining a normative commitment that had dominated, at least in mid-19th century France, democratic emancipation within negotiated practices of regulation. But when considering the move from the kinds of negotiated bon droit and scattered workers' modernities that were being supplanted by Durkheim's ideal of social integration, does one not catch a glimpse of other sets of possibilities for will formation that might be well suited to our contemporary workplace, perhaps in response to Durkheim to some extent? I am in many ways convinced of the idea of a democratic politics grounded in the generality of a social division of labor. But I wonder of the extent to which the scale at which this is to be done in a Durkheimian logic might not be problematic today, perhaps especially in context of the European Union. That is, in our current condition where democratic will formation in the workplace may not coincide with the operative scales of social integration, can a social division of labor account for the varieties of working conditions and sometimes very real local opportunities for workers to participate in their own regulation and regulatory practices? So I'll just leave that as a question and there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. And now we turn to Professor Honneth for a response. Professor Honneth.
Yeah, thank you very much. I thank all three discussants for the extremely valuable comments and recommendations, questions, criticism. And I have now 10 minutes to make the best of it, which is not easy.
Yeah.
Maybe I start with Elizabeth, and I say something about John Rawls. And practically, I want to say, I think you are right by emphasizing the degree to which, at least at certain side points, Rawls was concerned with labor and working conditions. I have to say, I grew up in an atmosphere where Rawls became the most prominent representative of, we would say today, a social democratic kind of political justice. But at that time, he was understood as a left-wing liberal thinker. And the criticism of Rawls I grew up with was directed against his ignorance about work and the degree to which he was or seemed to ignore that meaningful work or fair enough organized work contributes to self-esteem as a basic good, as he is describing it or determining it in the theory of justice. Only later I realized that, mostly in footnotes, I have to say, as far as I know, he is deeply concerned about the degree to which certain labor arrangements are undermining any possibility for the kind of justice he is envisioning. And I never got a clear picture how he exactly thinks about it. I know that he is more outspoken about this in his last political book. I mean, the book on how it's called, on fairness. But to bring all the pieces together, would the pieces where he is mentioning the requirement for fair enough working conditions and also enlarging or reshaping the division of labor. When we bring this all together, it would probably enrich his picture of the kind of socialist democracy he's defending in his last book. So I simply have to confess that I never attempted to bring these pieces together in such a way that they build a coherent view, that they can be combined as the coherent view of Rawls on how to reshape labor conditions in such a way that they sufficiently fulfill the requirements of the two principles. I wasn't able to see that. I got some notes from others that I should be more careful with Rawls, and I should look more intensively into Rawls to see where he is talking about labor and work. But I was so far not able to simply connect these different pieces. I am extremely grateful for your ideas and references to actual experimentations on reshaping care work, because I have to say this was one of the most dramatic tasks I saw I have to solve in the book, and I have to confess I wasn't really able to solve it. Namely, even when I criticize the narrow understanding of work in the philosophical political tradition, and I try to enlarge our understanding of work, including care and service work. I mean, the ignorance of the traditional authors with regard to service and care is incredible. But so I try to reform that and to do with a much broader concept and understanding of work. When I was thinking about work reforms, I was very often tempted to fall back in the old mistake, namely mainly think about and envision reforms with regard to what we call industrial work, because we are so learned into developing ideas about reforms within the work sphere in that domain that we have little resources for rethinking the conditions of care work. The only example I found, and I worked on that some years ago, was the Red Vienna. In the Red Vienna, which is the period, as most of you will know, directly or shortly after this First World War, when there were radical efforts by the socialists under lucky conditions, namely that they had the full power over Vienna, independent from the rest of Austria, to create almost out of nothing a kind of socialist community in Vienna. And they came up, and as I mentioned, the first and probably only resource I found with regard to how to think about democratization of care work and service work, they came up with some ideas about how to do that, especially by the specific housing they developed. Yeah, they thought they should have cooperative kitchens, not longer individual kitchens in the individual household, but they should have collective kitchens in each of the famous houses they were able to build. They were trying to establish communal groups of caretaking in these housings. So they had fantasies about how to reorganize not only industrial work at the center of production at that time, but also how to reorganize care work such that it becomes communalized or communicatively reorganized. And therefore, I'm extremely grateful to your examples, which I have to say I never heard of, which is my mistake, yeah? Because in my last chapter, I tried to find, like Eric Olin White is doing with regard to mostly industrial companies, find examples, I mean, real existing examples of attempts to reorganize and reshape care working. And the examples you gave were the first I've heard of, I have to say, out of our present time. So I guess I have to read your new book to learn more about this. I hope I can find it in the book because I didn't read it so far, to learn more about these examples, which would enlarge my social fantasy with regard to how to reshape not only industrial work or work areas like that, but also what is even more prominent today and much more prominent and will become even more prominent in the future, namely care and service work. I mean, we are living in a period where we have a radical transition from classical, traditional industrial work to new proliferations of service work, care work, and care work will become, I think, over time, the most dominant sphere of work in our kind of societies because of many, many kinds of demographic changes and so on and so on. So I'm grateful for these recommendations. Let me raise a question with regard to your interesting ideas about two let's say traditions of the Protestant work ethics. So this is also new for me. I mean, I learned to see the tradition of the Protestant work ethics mostly inspiring a kind of consumerist culture. Yeah, this is not exactly what Max Weber is telling us. I mean, he's more interested in the kind of work discipline created by the Protestant work ethics, but there are other historical investigations demonstrating that the Protestant work ethics mainly inspired the expansion of consumerism. And I think this is true, that there is another tradition of, let's say, incorporating the Protestant work ethic is new to me, and it remained a little bit unclear what you exactly mean. I mean, what I can see is that a certain inspiration by the Protestant work ethics, if there was something like that, this is probably a little bit doubtful, that it inspired a certain, let's say, conception of work, where work is seen as something of highest importance for the reproduction of society. So that what probably was developed was something like workers' pride on their own accomplishments. That influenced heavily the labor movement. I always thought it comes more from a Catholic background, yeah, but I might have been wrong on that. I thought Catholicism inspired what is called in the French tradition or in France the solidaristic movement, that it had Catholic roots and resources to emphasize that you as a worker have legitimate grounds for being pride on what you are doing, because this is what enables society to exist. And to learn that there is probably also a Protestant root for that is new for me, interesting, and so I only can learn on that. Last point, I completely agree, even if I don't touch on this in this book, about with regard to, let's say, destroying might be too hard work, but trying to eliminate the kind of banks we have today that see their main purpose and only purpose in allowing speculation to develop and to flourish. I think this is not our traditional understanding of what banks are for. They were always meant in the beginning of capitalism as being for the little people, for those people without money, and to help those people to develop their own endeavors, enterprises, and so on and so on. So this whole development, where banks have become private institutions for allowing speculation to flourish, is, in my view, a male development, a heavy male development. I don't see any political government being willing to limit that, but I'm sure if we ever have again something like a social democratic or socialist government wherever, it should start by starting. I mean, it should start with doing exactly that. Limitations on what banks are allowed to do, and limitations on the kind of speculative enterprises they are almost only engaged in today. Now, I go over to Alex. It's a sort of admiration for your kind of argumentation, because it was attempting to demonstrate to me that if it can be shown that my own proposals are not feasible today, then why then not go over to an even more utopian program? I mean, as far as I could see, that was the strategy of your argumentation. And I think it has a huge merit to argue like that. So I will, because everything depends, I think, in the way I defend my own proposals on whether I can sufficiently demonstrate that we can think of them as being sufficiently feasible, at least for the next future, not for the long future, but for the next future. Only then is what I refer to as this kind of Weberian realism justified. So it has to do a lot with feasibility. Now, I mean, taking our global situation, there are many reasons for being extremely pessimistic with regard to the chances for any kind of social reform, socialist reform strategy. But my memory is at least developed enough to know and to remember that the times when socialism was still, or social democratic policies were still capable of managing reforms within at least Western Europe. I think probably never in the United States, but in Western Europe, there all the programmatic ideas I come up with at the end of my book were thought of as being feasible, because the powers of business, of private business, were heavily reduced in comparison to what we have today. This is all going on, let's say, in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s. So if I think, I mean, I'm not as old that I can say I was able to perceive what happened as a person already, but in remembering that period in which I became a member of the Young Socialists in Germany, we were not utopian when we believed we could limit the power of capital even more than it was already limited at that time. And this is only 50, 40 years ago. Yeah. So I think the programmatic ideas I have may sound quite unfeasible today. But if we have, again, a period where social democracy and socialist parties will regain political power, I think these are ideas that are surely feasible and are realizable. They all are presupposing, as you are rightly saying, they all are presupposing a limitation of the private power of capitalists, all these strategies. But remember the times when the power of capital was heavily limited, sometimes, by the way, in agreement with capital, strangely enough. I mean, that were other times. So I would say feasibility is a notion that needs historical concretization. What looks as being unfeasible today may be feasible within the next 30 years again. I think one of the reasons for, let's say, describing my own account, I think here in agreement with Elizabeth, as historical experimentalism, means that I don't want to operate with any ideas about an end state of social emancipation. I think we have learned that all speculation of that kind might have bad consequences, and therefore I am extremely reluctant to take on such utopian views you were alluding to at the end of your presentation. Yeah, I mean, a society where we can all realize work as kind of developing our own capacities. I mean, those visions Marx sometimes is operating with. I, since a long time, forbid myself to think in those categories in order to avoid the historical mistakes prevented or supported by certain strands of the socialist and the communist tradition. So I think in terms of experimentalism is presupposing the feasibility of the programmatic ideas it has at the moment. And so I think it would be too pessimistic to believe that we will not be able to recreate social and political conditions we had 40, 50 years ago in the coming future in a relatively visible time, so that these programmatic ideas can be seen as much more feasible as they look today. And so feasibility, I think this has a lot to do with the notion of feasibility and the logic behind it. Yeah, how to understand feasibility. That's probably a very complicated question, and I never thought about it. But I think feasibility should not. I mean, the question of whether something is feasible should not be too strictly limited to the social political conditions we are living under, but should also be able to reimagine periods in time of the past where the feasibility looked much more easier to be given than today. So probably my main argument against your proposal, when your program is not feasible, why not then even develop and operate with a more radical program? My answer would be that this is, on the one side, presupposing something I want to avoid, namely aiming at a certain end state of social emancipation, which I think is risky and dangerous. Instead, I propose to operate with a kind of experimentalism. This all has also to do with the question, with the problem that we don't know any longer how to spell out the social and political institutions of a fully socialist society. We only have made negative experiences with certain understandings of it. A centrally planned economy has gone wrong, and so we have to be more cautious. I'm talking too long. Yeah, I see. I'm talking too long.
I go ahead.
Give me 2 more minutes.
In about 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
So going over to Stephen, who brought up a very interesting question about which I think I never thought sufficiently about. And you actually have 2 questions, historical questions. The first question is, why have I a certain tendency, at least in my last publications, to jump from Hegel to Durkheim and the later traditions without taking sufficient into consideration everything that happened in between? And that in between is a long period of 50 years, let's say, minimally. Yeah. And so that's the first question. And then the second question is whether it is not necessary to have to respect the distance we have meanwhile to Durkheim's own ideas in one specific regard. So let me try to answer the 2 questions in short time. It may be that I have a certain tendency to understand socialism as being divided in 3 possible different versions of socialism. And if I explain these 3 different versions, you will understand why I have a certain tendency to overlook and to ignore a certain period in that history. I think we have a Kantian version of socialism, which has a very deep history. It influenced German social democracy. It influenced also, I think, Rawls. We see that there is a kind of socialism that is inspired by the political ethics of Kant and his moral theory. Then we have a Marxist tradition of socialism. And I tried in my book on socialism to work out the arguments that speak about against such a Marxist version of socialism. It has many reasons. The central reason is that I think Marx's understanding of socialism as the future kind of society is heavily bound to the industrial period of modern development. It is a version of socialism that is built on the premises of an industrial economy. And it is not sufficiently able to overcome its limitations with regard to that. then there is a third version, and that's the version I personally am supporting. That is a kind of Hegelian socialism. And so I tried to work on that a little bit longer, even thinking of writing at least an article on the Hegelian socialism, because there is a longer tradition that takes up not Kantian ideas and not Marxian ideas when it comes to the determination of what socialism is supposed to mean, but that takes up Hegelian ideas. And that are people, on the one side, shortly after Hegel, not belonging to the Marxist group, but building liberal circles defending socialism. Stein is one of them, but there are disciples of Hegel that visit France in order to come into conversation with the early socialists and to develop Hegelian ideas further within the framework of French early socialism. Then you have the British Hegelians that also in their political writings take up certain inspirations by Hegel and are radicalizing these Hegelian insights into a program of a kind of Hegelian socialism. The first one to tell me that was Bernard Williams, who thought he has to tell me, and I think it was right, that it is interesting to see that the English labor movement and the English Labor Party was more influenced by Hegel than by Kant or by Marx. And so I learned to see that there is a subterranean history and tradition of a Hegelian kind of socialism that I would like to defend, with certain exceptions. I mean, experimentalism is an idea that was brought to this tradition by John Dewey, and I think he was completely right in correcting Hegel in his philosophy of history, which is too teleological and too deterministic. So I try to reconstruct an idea of socialism that is a further development of this invisible tradition that can be recovered. That explains a little bit, I think, that is an attempt to answer your first question. That is the reason, if I'm concentrating more on the second half of the 19th century, I'm looking much more to liberal socialists than those which are normally in the forefront, and that is Marx and his disciples. So I try to think of certain people in the liberal tradition in France, in England, and in Germany that try to develop a more reformistic understanding of socialism, liberal understanding of socialism, however you want to name it. That doesn't answer the second question, and the second question is completely legitimate. And I think you are right. I think we can't simply jump from Durkheim to our present time, because Durkheim's own concepts are heavily depending on the nation state. Everything he's talking about, even when not explicitly, is relying on societies that are confined by national states or determined by the nation state. And even when this is not the time to be too optimistic with regard to Europe, I think we have learned over the last 20, 30 years that we should not think any longer, when we talk about societies, in too heavily nationalistic terms. We have learned that globalization started much earlier, that nation states are not as confined as we thought, that there were always kind of transactions between the different nation states. There were always already global institutions and so on. So we have learned to think more in global terms than in nationalistic terms. Durkheim still was heavily depending on such a nationalistic understanding of sociology and of social science and of society. So that means as you said, we can't simply jump from Durkheim up to into our present. We have to make certain revisions, and we have to rethink what he's talking about when he's talking about the division of labor. We have to rethink that in more global terms, and that is extremely difficult, I have to say. I can imagine that for Europe, I have much more difficult to think that in the global space. So maybe I should leave it with that because I talked too long.
Thank you so much, Axel. I think that was very instructive. And I would like to invite Behailu. Has anybody asking for questions? So we'll invite our respondents to take floor. Elizabeth, would you like to say something?
Just one quick response to Alex's complaint about no feasible path. Speculative capitalism will always crash. Okay, it's inevitable. I think a great opportunity was missed in the 2007-8 crisis to decapitate the commercial banks and their power. In fact, there was enormous public outrage against the way the banks brought down the global economy and the bankers and the financiers and the speculators. It would have been a great opportunity, you know, built into the financial guarantees. There's actually a cap, legally a cap on how much people can get back, you know, the FDIC insurance. And the Federal Reserve decided to compensate, basically bail out everybody's losses, including the richest. What they should have done, obviously they were not prepared. People hadn't thought about a plan in advance. We need to think carefully about how in the next crisis, we had to put a ceiling on how much bailouts people can get and you decapitate the billionaire class. That would take us very far, in addition to aggressive antitrust, which is already well under development, in thinking creatively about how to be much more aggressive about breaking up the biggest corporations and hence the foundations of, you know, oligarchic wealth.
Alex.
I'm happy to wait for questions that people have. Okay. I feel like people have listened to us for a long time.
Stephen.
If there are questions, I very much appreciate the Professor Honneth's response, and one of the things I've been particularly interested in is the Hegelian reception that the reception of Hegel in France in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s that I think actually was very creative, but precisely for the reasons that he just spoke of. So yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, Behailu, will you call? Yeah, Axel wants to say something. Go ahead, Axel.
Yeah, one short remark. There is one specific figure that is worthwhile to look in, and that is Eduard Ganz. Eduard Ganz was a disciple of Hegel. He was a lawyer from profession, and he visited regularly France in order to talk with the disciples of Saint-Simon and especially with representatives of the young socialists. So there was a kind of communication, interestingly, still at the time when Hegel was living, between this center of French early socialism and Berlin via Eduard Ganz. So the figure to look at would be Eduard Ganz. And there are interesting publications on the central role of Eduard Ganz in that tradition.
Thank you. Behailu, we have any questions?
Yeah. Summer, would you like to ask, or should I read it for you?
Please call the person in.
Summer Papachin.
Hi. Yeah, no, sure, I can ask him myself. Hi, Professor Honneth, and hi, everyone. My question is, how can we incorporate insights from Black feminism and third world feminism, such as intersectional theory and coalition building, especially when it comes to trying to understand workers as, you know, workers of color, as women workers, gendered workers, right, racialized workers, How can we like understand basically frameworks from racial theory, post-colonial theory, gender theory into this theory of like labor and worker democracy that you have so beautifully articulated in this book? And also, do you think there is merit in, you know, rethinking these categories of worker and work within political theory, using, especially when it comes to worker democracy, right? Using these frameworks of post-colonial gender, racial theory, just in order to understand maybe worker oppression as class oppression in conversation with all these other kinds of oppression. Do you think there's merit to doing that kind of work? Do you think it requires a different kind of theoretical approach, or do you think that it can be accommodated without like much revolutionizing or overthrowing of much anything in kind of how we're already approaching this work? But yeah, thank you for this conversation. It's been incredibly insightful for my own work and everything.
Before Axel, you respond, or anyone else elects to respond, Behailu, are there any more questions? We might have more than one question.
Not with me.
Not so far. I mean, I think Margaret Solis is. Margaret, you want to ask some question?
Yeah, I have a question that is somewhat related to that, but in terms of bringing in additional perspectives, but also does take up the question of like pragmatism and implementation. Thinking about education in the United States is kind of an interesting example, particularly as it considers the like history and the collection of developing an institution based on a common need that arose, you know, out of the common school and really a duty to service, but also different models across the US that were more, you know, profit seeking. And so I'm thinking about recently across the Southern United States where there's been an effort to move away from just teachers involved or accredited individuals involved in the classroom and schools, which seems similar to a service orientation that you're speaking about. And it's resulted in a lot of religious investment in education, such as in Texas, where they allow for mental health professionals that are from like religious backgrounds instead of religious care and stuff like that. And so I'm thinking about the very pragmatic nature of how this might go down, particularly in the United States, where there are so many interests and a rising vocal voice of religious interests. You know, how do you deal with this very real question of what would be considered service, and how institutions that are currently, you know, under threat for religious reasons like education, like how do we deal with this navigating between this, you know, notion of service, but also the very real interests, and how that might manifest in the type of service that would be permitted, the type of policies or education that would be promoted in the service that people give, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. And let's take these two questions, and let's see if Professor Hannah or also Professor Anderson might want to say something to Margaret's question. Go ahead, Professor.
Well, actually, both Summer and Margaret are raising some really critical issues. Women of color do vast majority of care work in the United States. I'm not familiar enough with the demographics of Europe to say that, but it's obviously very prominent. And so the experimentation that I describe is very much about upskilling and enhancing the autonomy of care workers and connecting that with community building and relationship building to turn care work into something that's both meaningful and that enhances the capabilities of the recipients of care rather than just meeting bare minimal biological needs. So I think there's some potential there for upgrading the nature of the work that women of color do. With respect to Margaret's point, a lot of what's happening in the South with the promotion of vouchers and is to recreate segregation academies. That's what a lot of it is about. I think it's actually, it's contrary to a long history stemming out of Brown v. Board of Education. Of course, we have a hostile Supreme Court that isn't going to pay attention to that. However, there is genuine, real potential for the mobilization, democratic mobilization of voters, especially in rural school districts, because it's their schools that are getting shut down in order to pay vouchers to religious schools, which are too far away to send their kids. We already have successful revolts in Georgia and Tennessee against certain voucher systems because rural voters actually are aware of the peril that their own public schools, which are the only schools they can afford to attend, are involved. Segregation academies are essentially hostile to the public school system. That's the whole point of them. But you can actually mobilize voters against that.
Okay. Axel or anyone for the response?
I can't speak about the American situation, the US situation. So let me first take up Summer's question. I think postcolonialism and related new theoretical strands have, at least in two regards, heavy influence on how to think about the sphere of work and the organization of work. First, I think it has learned us that we were too heavily used to think of the capitalist working conditions only in terms of wage labor. I think it has made clear to us that slavery was never a part of history that had been overcome, but slavery continued for a long time in the centers of Western capitalism. So that we have to rethink our ideas about how labor is organized in the central areas of capitalism. We have much more forms of organization of work, namely enslaved work. We have slavery still in our horizon, so that the concentration on wage labor is probably a mistake. So we have to see that in many ways slavery is still existing in certain areas of service and care work today, where the support is coming from South America, from Africa, and people working in services are kept in a kind of slavery very often. So that means we have to differentiate our understanding of how work is organized in capitalism. This is one great contribution of postcolonialism to rethink this whole area. The other is that it has informed us and learned us to see the inequality in work conditions in racial terms. And that is true for, I think, whole Western capitalism, that work is much more racially organized than we probably have thought, at least myself, 30, 40 years ago. So this is another lesson we can learn from the theoretical movements you were referring to. And these are two very important contributions to this whole area we are talking about today.
Alex, you want to say something? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a quick response to Summer Papachan's interesting question. I suppose what I think is that any democratization of work is going to involve a struggle against those who aren't going to want it democratized. And winning that struggle would require a very large, disciplined mass movement that unifies workers across differences of race, gender, religious creed, and across different kinds of labor they do or don't happen to perform. And that therefore we would want to be suspicious of any way of thinking that would reinscribe or reimpose differences that would tend to fragment that kind of a movement. And to my mind, that is the standpoint from which one would have to kind of evaluate your question and the particular literatures that you mention, and would have to kind of go one by one and think about what direction you think it points you in. So that is my thought about your question.
You know, I would like to raise one of the things that is missing in our discussion in terms of when we were talking about the democratization work and the feasibility question. We are very much focusing on industrial labor, and then how we talked about move to the work of care. And also we talked about moving from national to the global level, especially the kind of a distance between the kind of division of labor and the democratic challenges as imagined by Durkheim as opposed to our time. So when we come to our time, one of the things that we have not mentioned while we have talked about post-colonial theory and all, is the difference with the challenge of democratizing work or labor, is when you make a distinction between formal economy as opposed to informal economy. The extent of informal economy in a country like India or in a country like Brazil is massive. And the way the challenges you will face about democratizing informal sector are very, very different from the way you would be facing challenges for democratizing the formal sector. And informal sector has some of those characteristics of self-negotiation and all, which Steve was referring to. In a very way, it is unregulated, but it has its own kind of a democratic dimension. But not to say that it's good, but you'll have to rethink about how you'll bring these two sectors together in this kind of a democratic movement.
And only one question. You make a distinction between formal and informal. And informal are all those areas of work that are completely devoid of any state regulation. Is that what you mean?
That is largely accurate.
Right.
Okay. Largely accurate, although they are in many ways, linked to the formal economy, because very often the formal economy would, for instance, textile or making apparels and things like that, they will be handed over by the formal economy, or a textile factory will hand it over to sweatshops in the ghettos and things like that. Right. So that is less regulated. It is regulated simply by the logic of demand and supply and what kind of labor is available and so on. So it is extensive, and it sort of runs parallel to virtually every sector of the formal economy, in every sector, including in finance, in lending and things like that. So you'd have to really pay attention to that, because at least good 50% of the world today works in informal economy rather than in formal economy. And that becomes...
This is only partly true for Western capitalism.
Yeah.
Where also the informal sector is growing heavily, mainly in areas of service and care work. I mean, in care work, it's exploding. Yeah, the state has no longer any control over the working conditions in huge parts of care work, because it is simply organized by direct, not even contracts, direct relationships between the caregiver, very often coming from non-Western countries, and the household, the household, how you say that, the leader of the household. So there's an exploding informal sector in work, also in Western
societies.
But I agree. I mean, you are completely right that one shouldn't ignore that 50%, as you were mentioning, of work in the global south is informally organized, so that the state has no control over it.
Yeah.
I agree to that, yeah.
So I would like to, Behailu, you're saying, is there
There
another
is a
question?
question from Tad Tetze. Tad,
Okay,
would
this
you
will
like
be
to
the
ask?
last question, and then, okay, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the really exciting seminar. That was really illuminating. But a question that had nagged me through all the discussion is the state of democratic politics today. It is the dominant trend for the last 50 years has been a growing alienation from politics at all levels of society, but more pronounced within the working class, according to most sort of surveys. Withdrawal from participation, withdrawal from other associated institutions like trade unions. Is it not possible that the problem is not that people don't have enough space to participate, especially working class people in their workplaces or outside their workplaces? They don't actually have, the problem is not that they don't have enough space to participate, but the problem is that these institutions and these processes are no longer seen as fit for purpose for them, and that increased participation, I mean, there have been waves and waves of attempts to increase participation, all kinds of different attempts to increase participation in unions and democratic politics and Labour parties and so on, and they all seem to fail, and there's a secular decline. Is it possible that they've just stopped being fit for purpose, and the next thing that needs to happen is not going to be on these kinds of models at all?
Can I say something to it?
Yeah, please.
Extremely interesting and challenging question. I tend to think about this in terms of a missing movement representing the interests of workers, of all employees, in a way it needs to be articulated. So if you take these famous books, for example, by Eribon, about the situation in France, where the workers' population went from left to the right, and they tend to be racist today, and they tend to vote for Le Pen. When you go a little bit deeper, and I think Eribon is already giving us the right indications, a lot has to do with the fact that there is no political party today that represents sufficiently the interest, concerns, and worries of these parts of the population. And that means they don't feel politics as being any longer of kind of help for their own worries and concerns. And therefore, they lose contact to the political realm, or, as in France, the United States, Italy, and wherever you look, they are going to vote for populist parties, right-wing populist parties, authoritarian parties, out of reasons whatsoever, sometimes racist reasons, sometimes reasons of feeling not longer heard in their society, or feeling like, famous title, a stranger in their own countries, because they think they are disadvantaged in comparison with those people coming in. False beliefs, but having enormously power on their own understanding of the political world. So I think this is definitely a problem. And one of the reasons I think we all are talking about working conditions has to do with that problem, that we are aware of the fact that a growing number of those people that are suffering most from the actual working conditions are going to the right. And to counter that kind of development over the last 20 years is one of the reasons I think we all are interested in the working conditions and repoliticizing the question of work.
Thank you. We are already 15 minutes past our schedule, and it's remarkable that we have holding on to as many, audience as we have. So I would like to thank first and foremost Professor Honneth for agreeing to participate on Questioning the Present Forum, and 3 respondents agreeing to participate in this, Professor Anderson, Professor Gourevitch, and Professor Sawyer, I'm very grateful that you've done this for us, and this has been very, very instructive. Thank you so much, and it has been a pleasure this afternoon.
Thanks to everyone, especially the discussants, and to you, Dilip.
Thank you for the
Bye-bye.
invitation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
It was a pleasure.
Hope to see you all again soon.